Well, she had one question, but she didn't see CPM. I told her.
Well, good afternoon in Arlington, Texas. Thank you all for joining us. We're delighted both to welcome the folks who are in the room with us today, as well as those who are joining us for the stream and subsequent recording. On behalf of the Learning, Innovation, and Network Knowledge Lab, the LINK Lab, we're delighted to welcome all of our groups here today. And we're particularly honored to be joined by Professor Dragan Gasevic. I get to practice my Slavic pronunciation in introducing him. Many of you have known Dragan as that he has been here this semester as a visiting research scholar, although a quick biographical update on him. Prior to coming to us, if there is life prior to the University of Texas, he was the Canada Research Chair in Semantic Learning and Technologies and full professor in the School of Computing and Information Systems at Athabasca. But once again, that's his past. Some of the most exciting work is ahead of him is that he's also taken a chairship at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland, and his time here is en route to Scotland, but we know he'll remain tied to us for many months and years to come. In trying to pigeonhole Dragan, you will have some problems because he brings a wide variety of expertise, both in learning and information, computation around learning in particular, next generation learning software, social learning, information making, sense making, self-regulated learning in networks, and I could go on and on and on in talking about his many different areas of research, but we're going to let him talk a little bit about it. And just quickly to wrap up, one of the most exciting areas where he does do work is reimagining what the learning management system might look like. I suspect you're going to hear a little bit about ProSolo today and his work in literally taking elements of online learning from a very didactic sense and meshing them with learning in a very social or social media sense, and helping us really look and see what the future of online learning might be in some of its most futuristic forms. So it's a real treat today to welcome my good colleague and friend, Dragan Gasevic. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks very much, Pete. It's my great pleasure to be today here to talk to you and to be here at UT Arlington. I had a great time last month and I'm looking forward to spending another few weeks here. So today I'm here to talk about learning analytics. I'm afraid I will not be talking too much about this particular product Pete mentioned, ProSolo. However, you will all have a chance to experience that product in about 5 days when we start our MOOC on learning analytics and data with edX. So part of that course will be also run in that platform. So the whole point of today's talk is to draw a bit of attention to the growing field of learning analytics, the field that we basically initiated and started working on about 4 or 5 years ago. The whole point of learning analytics is to address some of the pressing issues of today's educational landscape. What we are presently seeing in education is a growing demand. Well, many of us who are part of the educational sector were aware of this fact for a long time. We are also aware that we have many growing diverse populations. UT Arlington is especially informed about that fact given your diverse and growing population in that sense. However, what we are also experiencing in many other segments is that we are seeing that many people and many individuals have different educational needs. Not everybody is really required to have formal education. Many people really want to get some better support for their lifelong learning. The best evidence for that was the emergence of massive online open courses in 2012. Well, those courses actually date back to 2008 with the founders like George Siemens, one of your own here at UT Arlington, and Stephen Downes. However, the big fuss and the hype, we can say, was happening in 2012, when basically that was even declared the year of MOOC. So what we are trying to do here is basically, what we want to do is basically to address these growing demands. And technology is by many seen as that important component which is addressing that growing demand. So once we are trying to introduce technology, what happens is basically, it happens that we are increasing so-called transactional distances between instructors, students, and students, and students, as well as students and the content they are trying to study. So in that particular sense, what we are missing with the introduction of technology, but not only technology, but even big class sizes, is we are missing those feedback loops between students and their instructors. So with the field of learning analytics, we are trying to address this particular problem. We are trying to facilitate generation of that feedback in real time. So at the point in time when learning happens. So how this works? What is the general principle of learning analytics? This particular slide illustrates this issue. So we basically are aware that many institutions are using different learning management systems. As far as I'm aware, UT Arlington is using Blackboard. So Blackboard is one of your learning management systems. In addition to that, every institution keeps track of their students. So for example, every course our students enroll, every grade our students receive, even additional socio-demographic variables that are describing our learners. So those are basically stored in the so-called student information systems. So no matter, so each interaction of our students with the learning management systems is being recorded. Not only that, many instructors today, and Laurel is here leading a very interesting group of instructors who are keen on innovating education and advancing educational technology use inside of their teaching practices. And they are trying to also innovate with many additional types of technology. Some of them are interested in using ways for introducing videos. Others are trying to use different social networking software. Other individuals are trying to improve reflection of their students by using blogs. Others are trying to also introduce different types of search engines so that their students are getting better at seeking information. But what is happening, no matter what our students are doing with all these different types of technologies, they are always leaving a digital trace. That digital trace is describing the types of activities and the engagement with the learning material that we provided them to work on. So the point of learning analytics is then to collect those digital traces, to measure different information of relevance for teaching and learning, then to perform different types of analysis by building on the existing research in statistics, machine learning, and data mining, and then try to report those data to both students and educators for the sake of providing better feedback and insights into the learning activities and the level of the engagement of our students. So this is the big picture of learning analytics. This is something which should get you going very easily to discuss about learning analytics. So what are some of the lessons learned about learning analytics, and what are the challenges that we are aware that are related to the field of learning analytics? Well, let's start from one of the success stories, or the best-known case studies. It comes from Purdue University. It's called Course Signals. The system developed in about 2006, 2007. They exactly did what I just described. They used these digital traces from their learning management system, also Blackboard, and they use additional data from their student information system. Then what they were interested in Course Signals was to predict which students were at risk inside of individual courses. So to do so, they pretty much used a machine learning technique. Well, actually, they didn't even use so sophisticated machine learning technique. They used a well-known statistical model, which is called logistic regression. And then they decided to predict 3 particular types of learning outcomes. The first one is students at high risk to fail a course, students at a moderate risk to fail a course, and students not at risk at all. Those 3 outcomes were then translated into a very simple, easy to understand metaphor visualized through traffic lights. So basically, all those students who would be identified high risk would receive red light. Those who would be at moderate risk would receive yellow light, and those who were not at risk, they would be receiving these green lights. What they basically then observed by following a whole cohort of students from 2007 until 2011, that they basically had a significant, considerable increase in student retention for those students who completed at least one course with Course Signals compared to the students who completed a course who never interacted with Course Signals. So that was a really interesting case study. It shows the potential of the analytics to be used in education. However, they also decided to perform further analysis of the effects on teaching practice that were basically generated by Course Signals. And in that process, what they decided to do, they went on and collected all the messages that course instructors sent to their students inside of the courses in which Course Signals was used, and then analyzed what type of feedback instructors sent to their students. So in particular, they looked, for example, whether they send them formative feedback, and those of you who are familiar with the educational principles, those are the types of feedback that are helping learners to identify and guide them in the process of their studying. They are scaffolding some of the learning activities that they need to engage more in identifying the types of problems they are struggling with. The additional type of feedback is typically happening in the end of the course, and it's just summative feedback. So what they actually observed in this particular study by performing the content and the analysis of the messages is that instructors predominantly generated summative feedback types. They were rarely providing students with any kind of instructive or formative feedback types. And of course, they found no association between the summative feedback type and students' success. The only thing which was different here, instead of students being provided only once or twice with a summative feedback type, now students receive a massive amount of summative feedback type, right? So basically, what happened here is that students were alerted that they were not doing well. However, they were not receiving additional guidance and help from their instructors. Therefore, what we can conclude with the Course Signals is, although it is useful to identify potentially students at risk, it does not provide much information about something actionable that instructors and students can do about their learning and teaching. Simply because Course Signals was not designed to provide deep details about the learning issues and details that students are dealing with, so that instructors and students as well can help themselves and be provided with additional guidance. Therefore, what we want to be here very careful is to distinguish between what we are providing with academic analytics, which is precisely what Course Signals is doing, which is doing a great job at academic analytics, and what learning analytics should be providing us with. So in this particular case, we need to be very careful that we cannot simply assume if we correlate two random variables and we identify that a certain variable is statistically significant with another variable, that will lead into some really useful, actionable outcome. So this is a really nice article which was published in New York Times earlier this year, where they identified 8 or 9 different issues that we may have where we need to account for when we are dealing with big data. And in this particular sense, one of these examples was basically in this particular period of time from 2006 until 2011, we could find this big correlation between the use of Internet Explorer and in principle, the murder rate in the US. But we, of course, cannot attribute that, or at least some of us would think so, although some people who don't like Microsoft products may not agree with that. Anyways, but we will not go there today. So the whole point with this is then how can we understand learning if we are just focusing the learning analytics on a single outcome, as we saw in this particular case study, student retention. Student retention is a very important outcome for educational purposes. However, learning analytics has additional goals, and those are to understand and explain learning, and in addition to that, to help students enhance their learning outcomes and learning processes. Therefore, we cannot just be then focusing on a single particular type of outcome. So this is the whole basically message about what are the major challenges or the lessons learned about learning analytics. All right, so what is then the direction that learning analytics needs to take? Well, my proposition is that learning analytics should take basically process and context focus so that we can then better understand both learning and the context and situations in which learning occurs. Without that, we cannot really be talking about the improved learning outcomes, because without understanding of processes. So that basically brings us to the main message of my talk today, is that learning analytics is really about learning. And no matter what we are doing with these new types of data that are describing learning and learning processes, we cannot be divorced from what we already know about learning and teaching. We basically need to connect learning analytics with the existing research in education and the learning sciences so that some meaningful and actionable outcomes can be produced and very widely accepted practices. So basically, in this particular sense, the first and foremost concept in this field should be then learning. So in understanding then learning, and when I say learning analytics is about learning, then we really need to go deep down into what we know about learning and teaching. Well, summarizing what we know about learning and what we know about teaching in a single talk would be absolutely impossible. There are potentially some useful resources that could be used, like, for example, the book of John Hattie out of the University of Melbourne, in which he summarized many different effect sizes in his book, Visible Learning, which is really excellent resource. However, where I'm actually coming from and what I'm suggesting is basically that the work of Phil Winnie out of Simon Fraser University in Vancouver could be used as a good starting point to understand some of these basic principles of learning. In his article published in 2006 in Educational Psychologist, he tried to summarize learning by deriving 3 major axioms. Today I'm going just to discuss about 2 major axioms, and those are on this particular slide. The first axiom is that learners construct knowledge. By this learners construct knowledge, we mean very precisely the following. Learners are using tools to operate on raw information in order to create products of their learning. This is very abstract, so let's try to simplify it. Tools could be cognitive, digital, and physical. And those, for example, digital tools could be, let's say, discussions. So students could use discussions to, for example, better understand and provide reflective understanding of a particular piece of information that we are teaching them in a class. So when we are trying to have our students to use discussion forums, we basically need always to have certain outcomes. Or we don't have to explicitly have those outcomes, but discussion in a way carries certain particular types of outcomes. So for example, helps us to develop better argumentation of particular reason that we want to have. Or it can help us to even develop critical thinking. So in that particular sense, products of learning are either critical reasoning about a particular topic, or it is, for example, it could be argument why certain idea and what are the cons and pros of a particular concept, such as, for example, fracking in biology and environmental science. So what happens basically when your students are using, for example, discussions? They are always using certain standards in terms of how much, for example, time they are going to spend on those discussions. Also, they are using standards in terms of how many different sources of information they are going to use to put together a good justified argument. In addition to that, students are eventually making those decisions based on something which is called conditions. Why? Those conditions are then leading into the second thing, which is students' agency. That is to say, no matter what we do in a single course, it is still students call what operations, what tools, and what information they are going to study and pay attention to. So for example, if we say to our students to use discussions, well, that's fine. So many of our students may jump on using those discussions, but maybe they don't know how to use those discussions effectively. That is to say, they are lacking the level of metacognitive knowledge about how effectively to discuss online and how that can benefit their learning. So in that process, then basically what we are suggesting is to use this paradigm of copies, which basically pretty much summarizes what elements can be used to describe learning. First one is conditions. Conditions are, for example, internal and external conditions. External conditions are our tasks, task conditions. For example, whether we are going to grade our students on the use of discussion forums or not. That's a very simple condition. The second external condition could be what sources of material we are providing to our students. Basically, everything which describes a learning task is an external condition. Internal conditions are something which our learners have in them. For example, prior knowledge about a particular problem they are studying. Another internal condition could be, for example, the level of metacognitive awareness that, for example, discussions are beneficial for their learning at all. If learners are not aware that discussions could be beneficial for their learning, they are not going to use it. Not because they are not motivated, but because they don't know that that may be beneficial for them. That's another important internal condition. Another one could be epistemic belief about a particular subject domain or a particular study tool, and so on. Operations I already mentioned, basically whether students are using reading or whether students are creating a critical argument, etc. Then products of learning, we already mentioned. For example, that could be memory recall, if you are after that, or it could be critical argument. In addition to that, students are then using their standards, as we already described, to evaluate the products of their learning. So for example, in many cases, students may stop to study simply because they use poor standards for evaluating their learning products. Let's say memory recall. Students may simply stop to study something because certain particular piece of text seems very familiar to them. Although it's been consistently proven in self-regulated learning research that basically that's one of the well-known biases. Therefore, in that particular case, students are using wrong, incorrect standards to evaluate products of their learning. All right. So this is really, really kind of abstract, in a way, metaphor. So what is really practical here? Yeah, let's take a question.
Oh, no, it just makes me think of the way we teach students to write. This actually is very concrete. This reminds me of the way we train teachers to write behavioral objectives.
Yeah, makes sense.
So we use the CABC model, condition, audience, behavior, criteria. So it
Yeah.
speaks to me.
Good, good. I'm glad. That's great. And I think, I mean, we apply this model to both the types of conditions in which students are provided with a particular types of learning outcomes, but we also apply this model in other types of conditions in which basically people like George Simmons, they basically indicated courses may be organized even without preset learning outcomes, at least on the end of instructors, right? So that's why this paradigm is very effective. So let us then see how this paradigm may inform learning and learning analytics in general. So I'm going to go now through three particular case studies. The first case study is just describing these external conditions. To what extent my teaching scaffolds and my teaching guidance can influence students' learning and learning outcomes. and in particular then to what extent that may also affect our learning analytics. So we are going to start basically from online discussions. So this is a well-known framework which is developed in Canada, but probably one of the best known frameworks for online and distance education. It is called the Community of Inquiry model. It consists of 3 particular types of presence. Each of them has a very intuitive name. Teaching presence, which is pretty much our either direct instruction, instructional design, or facilitation of students' learning. The second component is called social presence. Social presence is something which we need to establish for students to feel comfortable, to trust other learners inside of a community so that they can open up and engage into meaningful conversation. The final outcome of these discussions and the focus should be on cognitive presence. Cognitive presence is something which is defined through the following 4 phases, and behind it, it is something which is called the practical inquiry model. Basically, cognitive presence indicates that students typically start their inquiry in a community, but even by themselves, through basically a certain sense of puzzlement. They don't understand a particular problem they are trying to solve. They are externalizing that sense of puzzlement, and they are creating so-called triggering events. Then, with the rest of the group, they are going through the process of exploration. Some of their peers may eventually step in and provide certain resource. Another colleague may just step in and say, well, this is a solution, but basically it's really just a leap into conclusion without really proper solution. Finally, some of these colleagues may brainstorm some really good ideas until the third student may step in and say, well, here's a hypothesis. Here's a good solution. That student would integrate information from 2 or 3 other messages provided by the students, but also will use additional information from the course readings, as well as use information found on the web. And that's called the integration phase. Final phase of that inquiry is basically so-called vicarious testing of the solution. So that testing process goes by interrogating that hypothesis and finding the conditions under which the proposed solution works. In that process, students then eventually identify where are the weaknesses in their solution, and that may open additional types of triggering events. So why this is model important and why I'm talking about it? This model is used with these 4 precise phases to code messages, so that we can see what is the effectiveness and the quality of the discussions that our students have. So this is very important. We code these messages through the process of conventional content analysis, as many individuals know. And typically, the unit of analysis in that process is a message. What we basically found in experimenting with this is that if we do not scaffold discussions of our students, students will stay at very low level of cognitive presence. And it basically tells us one important thing. First of all, students are not really aware how to effectively discuss. Even if we are talking about grad level students, even if we are having a really high level of grading for those discussions, it doesn't mean students are not motivated. Say, if in a course we are providing 15% of the final mark of those discussions, that means a significant budget of the final grade for students that they need to step in and work on that. However, that may not be still sufficient. However, once we provide a certain scaffold guiding students and pretty much inducing external standards for them how to effectively provide discussions and discuss, then we can then increase the quality of discussions and basically increase the level of integration and phase times of messages for about 2.5 standard deviations. And we know in education that's a big number. If we know that, for example, we consider everything above 0.4 standard deviations above average significant effect size in education. But why this is again important for learning analytics? Well, if learning analytics is to provide us predictions, for example, about the outcomes, then basically what we want to see is that these instructional conditions are moderating the relationships between, say, these cognitive presence counts of messages and the final grades. So, for example, in this particular case, I'm showing the correlations between students' assignments and the final grade and the counts of messages in each of these particular phases. None of them was significant when we had very poor quality messages for our students. However, the moment we improved and pushed our students into the high level quality of these messages, all of a sudden integration phase became significant, consistently throughout every particular component of the course. And it explained about 25% of the final grade variability of students' grades, which basically means, and we applied this model in several other settings, and we found a very similar pattern as well. So that basically means that when we are doing our learning analytics, we need to carefully account for instructional conditions. Even a new revision of the course may completely confound our results of the learning analytics. Therefore, if someone comes to you and tells you, we have this beautiful predictive model which was built on top of, I don't know, tens of different types of schools and hundreds and thousands of different courses, that may not be very relevant for your particular course, because your course has very specific instructional conditions that need to be carefully accounted for in the development of these types of predictive models. Otherwise, that predictive model will not result into something very actionable in your particular case. In the case of this model, it's very practical. It tells us basically that the quality of these discussions need to be improved and that we need to provide additional types of scaffolds guiding students how to effectively discuss. Here's another implication of this. When we basically look at the students and the quality of their discussions, when they were divided into the quartiles based on these integration messages, all those students who were in the lowest quartile, they failed the course. And we could derive this after week 5 of a 12 weeks long course. This was a grad course, so basically the pass was 70% in the particular case. So this is one important thing that we need to account for. There's another important thing which comes directly from students' agency. And that is to say that what we need to do is basically we need to account for internal conditions, that is to say the level of metacognition and motivation of our students. We are again returning to the very same example of our students who are discussing. But now what we decided to do, rather than just looking into the counts of messages, we also wanted to see the amount of time and different types of activities our students perform online. So for example, we looked from the number of logins into the course to the number of assignments, different types of resources and time spent, and then we basically also looked into different types of discussions. Then eventually what we decided to do, we decided to apply cluster analysis on our data set so that we can identify emerging profiles or the subpopulations of students who are sharing similar, at least, strategies to learn in this particular course. What we basically identify are 6 different clusters, but they are quite consistent with the existing literature. They are showing basically similar types of learning strategies. I would like you now to pay attention to 2 particular clusters. Cluster 1. Cluster 1 is this group here, and you can see this line here. Cluster 1, according to this line, spends under average on almost every particular type of activity. According to many myths that we can hear in learning analytics, this cluster is in big trouble. They are at risk. There's another cluster here who is spending enormous amount of time and effort online. And according to many learning analytics myths, this cluster is doing well. This is the exemplary cluster. So cluster 1, they are the individuals in trouble. Cluster 4, those are the individuals who are really doing well. Let's now look at the products of their learning. Cluster 1, students in trouble. This is the integration phase for them in their discussions, but also is very similar in the learning, in the grades of these students. They're the top students in the class. Basically, these students know what they are doing. They are effective learners. They have strong prior knowledge, they have very strong metacognitive knowledge, and they are doing well. So they are not spending enormous amount of time online because they don't need more than what they are spending. This cluster 4, they're doing all right, but they are really not the top group of students in the class. Basically, they are highly motivated students, but probably they are lacking a bit of metacognitive existing knowledge, and also they are probably not that great with their prior knowledge as well. Therefore, this group of students, although they are highly motivated and it's a great group of students that you would like to work with, they still require additional different types of scaffolding than this other group of students. Therefore, what I basically want to emphasize here when we are interpreting data about learning analytics, even as instructors, we need to distinguish between these different subpopulations of students because they have different needs. And therefore, for each of these different groups of students, we'll need to provide very specialized, tailored feedback to guide their learning because it's not always the same. The final case study that I'm going to talk about is now the interaction of these external, like teaching condition, and internal condition, or students' decisions and agency that students are exhibiting. So in particular case, many instructors will always indicate that the use of technology, but also any effort that our students are exhibiting is always driven by the assessment. If we are not assessing something, students will never use it, or students will never do it, right? So what we wanted to basically do is we wanted to check whether and to what extent this is correct. So this handsome gentleman, everybody I think knows, George. So he is basically our model that we are using in the inside of the research project in which we are developing the video annotation software. The software is called Class, and Class basically allows for annotating software, for annotating videos of students inside of this particular software. In particular, it allows to stop at any point in time in a video and to add a so-called timestamp annotation. In addition to that, it allows students to also create a general annotation about the entire video. In addition to that, those annotations could be shared by other peers if students wish to do that. And in some pedagogical models, we want or require students to do so. And then students can also get a visualization showing them where is the most of the visualization or most of the annotations happening inside a particular class, so that they get also a bit of awareness of what's happening and create that cooperative effort. So we decided then to have a case study at the University of British Columbia, their School of Music, in several conducting classes. So in the first semester when we went, we basically focused on two particular courses. In course one, students had the use of Class in a non-graded condition, and they received no feedback from the instructor how to use Class. However, they received a kind of scaffold how to use Class. That was it. The other course basically requires students to create a reflection of their own performance. So in particular case, this course, students were requested to perform in a class. Their performances were recorded, and then the recordings of those performances were uploaded into class. And then students were requested to reflect on their own performance. So then their reflections were graded. So in this other course, it was a similar scenario, except that they were not graded. That was the only difference. So what was the use of class? Well, according to the general hypothesis we already said, or this general understanding, those students who were assessed in terms of the number of annotations, they were basically almost 5 times more active. In terms of the time spent, again, similar pattern, again, in terms of the pause, rewind, and other event. However, what we can also here see a kind of an interesting trend. These darker colored bars are the students who took both courses at the same time. So basically, those students who were in the graded condition, they had a tendency always to use Class more than those students who were not using both of these courses. That is to say, we already sense that there is a kind of a resonance of students to use this tool even in another condition, even though they were not rated in this other condition more than when they are graded. So then we focused on the second semester. Second semester basically was offered generally 2 courses. Those 2 courses had course 2, in which class was graded, as the prerequisite. So in this particular case, in course 3, the entire task condition and requirements for students in terms of grading, self-reflection, etc., were identical, except there was a particular focus on another type of conducting in the class. So results. Students who took both of these courses continuously with class, they almost doubled the use of class, although the task conditions did not double. Basically, let's tell us that students got familiar with the use of the tool, and then when they went on to the next course, they kept using class even more than they were using it previously. This is also another interesting thing for us is even the students who who enrolled into course 3 for the first time and didn't have previous experience with class in the previous course, simply because they basically got this prerequisite, say, 2 years, 3 years before this course was particularly offered, then they also increased. And we can see basically that students inside of the same class, they have influence on each other. There's some small group dynamics which was happening there. So basically we need to again account for that basically group influence in a particular course. However, this is where things became very interesting. Course 4. The same type of conditions, except that now those reflections with class are not graded anymore. So basically, according to our general belief, if students are not graded, they will not use class. Why bother, right? Here's what happened. Pay attention to these dark bars. Those are the students who took course 2 in the graded condition, and this is course 2. And now this is course 4. They're not graded anymore. They're almost at the identical level. So basically, being exposed to particular technology once, and if that is scaffolded well, students, if they see the value for their learning, they will continue to use it. Otherwise, they will not. Therefore, making assumptions in particular classes that certain technology is not being used by students because they are not motivated is not quite correct. Students will use it if they see the value and if they develop enough skills so that they can use that particular technology. However, we can also see that these are the students who were exposed to class for the first time, these light grade students. They again stay at a very low level because they were not scaffolded in the same way as these students who were in the dark bar condition, right? They didn't have exposure to class in the previous one. Basically, there was no big rock which forced them to be exposed to the particular technology to get that awareness. Once the students had that awareness, they would continue using it. However, we wanted still to check, well, that's fine, but these are still counts. But did really these students, although they use it to that extent so much, did they still actually metacognitively monitor their learning products? And whether basically the quality of their learning products was also at the same level as the products of these other students when they were graded. So first thing what we wanted to do basically was to measure the level of metacognitive awareness of our students and metacognitive monitoring in particular. So what we did basically is we decided to create so-called transition graphs that are describing the learning strategies that our students follow. So what we observe is, for example, there are distinct temporal patterns for students when they are interacting with video. For example, they leave annotations in the first 25% of a video, then pause in the second 25% of a video, then fast forward to the last 25% of the video. So this is exactly what we did. We decided basically to divide each video into these quartiles and then create these types of events. Annotation in quartile 1, pause in quartile 2, and so on. And then we created these graphs. We immediately saw the big difference, even at the surface, for these graphs. The students who were in course 2, compared to students in course 4, they had more dense graphs. When we basically then measured the level of density of those graphs, although the counts were identical, density of the graphs was not. And according to the research in self-regulated learning, low level of density basically equates to low level of metacognitive monitoring. So although our students continue to extensively use the particular technology, they were not anymore paying that much attention to details. And therefore, still they would be in a big need to have additional scaffold. So in this particular case, scaffold could be just simply expose your annotations, self-reflections with peers. Because we identify when they are using with the peers, the level of the metacognitive monitoring is much higher So don't grade them anymore, but just ask them to be basically a cooperative task and share your reflections with others. This is another and final implication of this sharing. It is in terms of the products of learning. We decided also to do text analysis of the reflections students created in class in the graded versus non-graded condition. And so what we basically found is we applied a tool which is called Cometrics, developed by the group of Art Gracer out of the University of Memphis. And basically it's used for measuring the text comprehension. And it's typically used for analyzing textbooks, etc. So in this particular case, what we found is basically that the level of cohesiveness of the students' messages significantly dropped. And that was kind of expected, simply because our students were creating and taking these reflections as their own notes. Notes that we are also taking when we are reading our papers, and we really don't care whether anybody will understand them or not. But the moment we intrude into that process by creating someone else's notes and reflections, then we start paying more attention to those particular details. That's why the additional significance of the use of grading. This is additional basic component about the cohesiveness of the messages, which was calculated by latent semantic analysis. All right. So these are basically some case studies, and so some final remarks. What data to collect? Who cares about the counts of activities of our students? We really need to look for analytics that are informed by the existing models of learning and teaching. Otherwise, our analytics will be useless. This is already something which is established in the field of information science, where they basically analyze and counted everything about libraries, how many students, how many times students came to library, how many books they took, etc. But basically, they never found anything significant to improve the practice and research of information science, and in general, and information seeking in particular, until they started building these these theorized models of information seeking. Then the question is, what data to collect? Well, we need to basically be creating these learning environments in which we need to capture context. For example, whether certain instructional intervention happened or not. Once we have that information, we know that this is a unique data set which requires particular type of interpretation, or what type of social networks emerge. Because basically, whether a task was socially open or not is very significant. The other thing is we need to account for these internal conditions. Making wild guesses like those students who are spending a lot of time online, they are doing well, versus those who are not justified. We really need to have measures which are able to provide good proxies, for example, of motivation or other types of activities. Additional types of data. Many of these data that we are presently collecting are just inside of particular silos, boxes. Those are online systems. So what we want to do here is we want to basically also provide analytics which can account for the classroom conditions, which can also account for regular informal activities of students. So we are now basically trying to look into these so-called multimodal types of analytics. For example, many different mobile apps students may be using. Students may always opt out, but different universities are trying to develop these types of apps that can guide students through their campus life, which can guide them through their library life, which can guide them through these informal activities. Students at any point can say, well, I'm not using this app anymore, so please don't try and data about me. Likewise, it is with wearable computing. We are seeing just small fragments of wearable computing, like Google Glasses, but there will be more and more of those, especially related to different types of physical activities. The other important thing for learning analytics is that we need to pay attention to scaling up qualitative types of analysis. You saw in these case studies that, for example, I had to manually code many of these messages. That's a very labor-intensive process. Nobody really wants to do that. However, there are some good tools, such as Cometrics, that can serve as very good proxies for some of these, for example, metacognitive or cognitive processing processes. Therefore, we need to pay attention more to that. The other thing which is very important for the field of learning analytics and general practice is that we cannot look at learning as just counts, static snapshots of particular outcomes. We need to basically account for learning as a very dynamic process with many internal feedback loops. So what I just showed were transition graphs, but there are other different types of potential methods that could be used, such as, for example, process mining, which can also tell us which type of events may be mutually exclusive. So, for example, what type of activity is hurting other type of activity that may students be performing. The other thing is, eventually, very important thing is that we need to account how the influence of the presentation of data to our students. Many are trying to offer solutions which are, say, telling students, this is how you perform compared to the rest of the class, in terms of the number of activities, in terms of time online, etc. There was a recent study at the University of Melbourne in which they interviewed and talked to the students about how they interpret some of these analytics. Some of the results are pretty frightening, and we need to pay attention much more into these types of analytics. For example, they found that students who are grade students, when they saw, for example, that they are doing better than average in the class, they thought they were doing well. And they didn't think that they had to put more effort, although they were underperforming compared to both their goals and also their previous achievement. Therefore, for some students, these types of analytics can be completely misleading, because what does it mean, class average, compared to an average student who doesn't exist at all? So we need to basically be very careful. On the other hand, in terms of presentation of the types of analytics and what is actionable for our instructors, is that basically many instructors, when they did the studies, they are not really so interested in the particular types of grades or understanding who of these students are at risk. But they basically expressed that they were much more interested to be able to go and pinpoint to the particular types of concepts students are struggling with and what type of operations students are performing on these concepts. So, for example, if the students are just reading particular concepts, but they are not self-testing and trying to exercise memory recall, if that is one of the outcomes that we want to have, that's a sign that students are using a very ineffective study strategy. Therefore, we can then instruct and provide advice to our students how to improve that particular concept. The other thing, what we also found was basically the importance of social networks and analysis where students are positioned inside of the classes. Otherwise, we are not really able to understand that class dynamic. Final few points is analytics is not a problem of computer scientists. Analytics is not a problem just of educators. Analytics is not just a problem of statisticians or just of students or instructors. Analytics is a problem for all of us. And therefore, if we are creating analytics, even at a level of institutions, we need to have these interdisciplinary teams, and each voice needs to be carefully accounted for and incorporated into these types of analytics that we are interested in. The other important thing is many are suggesting that we need to, within analytics, have this kind of new era of data-driven. Well, I think that's wrong. We need to have question-driven. What questions we need to answer with these analytics? If we are just presenting these data simply because we have those data, I'm not quite sure that's the best way to inform any of these decisions. And as we just saw from this example from the University of Melbourne, some of those could be hurtful, and we need to be very careful. Ethics. This is an important topic. George Siemens likes to talk about that with his dropping pens metaphor. But we basically cannot avoid this issue. It has to be always carefully considered. What are the implications? What is the level of trust? If we don't have all the stakeholders who fully trust into our analytics and data collection, then we are in trouble. And the final point, development of analytics culture. So we all need to learn and embrace how to deal with data. In many cases, we are trying to promote analytics as if they are some kind of a silver bullet, which will solve our problems. But in many cases, they will not solve all our problems. We still have many tacit knowledge that many instructors have in their heads, that they know their students well, but simply in many cases they don't know how to externalize that. And this is the final metaphor that I typically like to use in terms of development of this culture. One is basically this Moneyball movie with a great example how analytics and different statistical methods can be used to improve, for example, and optimize team dynamics and create great outcomes. However, this other movie is Trouble with a Curve, is again about baseball, and with old scout who basically is following several students who are just about to be drafted for Major League. And what he is observing is that this particular kid has a problem with something, but he's unable to externalize that. On the other hand, all the statistics and the predictive models are showing that that kid will be great. And eventually it turns out that the kid had a problem with the curve. Quite honestly, as a European, I have no idea what the problem with the curve is. But you all here, I'm sure, are very much aware of that problem. In any case, I think it's a really essential thing that we need to account for these types of issues and that type of tacit knowledge and the process of sense-making. The data needs to be carefully inspected so that we can then have a data culture. And this is the final slide. Thank you very much for your attention. There's a bit of a paper that we wrote recently which summarizes this talk and some of the major ideas. So you can basically download from this website and basically see and find some of the references. In any case, the talk will be online and the slides will be also online, so you can find all these references on the website. Anyways, happy to take some questions now. Thanks.
We have a few minutes, so if you want to continue discussing, please ask a few questions.
Yes.
Okay, I'm really interested in the background knowledge component of learning, so what learners bring, whether it's next to nothing or a great wealth of knowledge. So, for instance, in teacher education, we distinguish between novices and experts. So how does that, I don't know that I saw that in some of the case studies you presented. So how, and I know that that can make a world of difference in terms of everything.
Yes. In many cases, the measurement of prior knowledge is a challenge. So how do you measure that prior knowledge, right? So in many cases, what they are doing, for example, in the area that Ryan Baker talked about, I think 2 weeks ago, about cognitive errors, they have these pretests. But the question becomes whether those pretests are effective or not. So in some other cases, for example, if the critical thinking is the outcome, then pretest is not really effective. In that case, it would be much more effective to have an essay for students to prepare. There are already essay grading techniques that could be applied and identified. The other thing is basically what we can also identify about the level of prior knowledge is basically by inspecting the type of the arguments students are making, say, in online discussions, the types of notes they are making, or the types of highlights the students are dealing with inside of their online environments. And in that particular case, then we can then see and build that model of the students' knowledge. So in particular case, if students are coming, say, from high schools, then inside of at least university, we can start building that model. But if we basically look at analytics from K to grave, as Ryan Baker likes to say, then these so-called knowledge graphs could be created, and we can at any point in time know a particular level of knowledge that the individual has about particular topics and issues. Yes?
Could you say some more about cometrics and what it can be used for, what kind of measurements you get out of it? I think there were a couple of words like cohesiveness and something in there. Could you say a bit more about what those measures are?
Yes, so it's a very comprehensive instrument. It has over 100 different measures, but eventually they narrow down to 8 particular principal components. I cannot recall every single one of those components, but basically you can measure general purpose. What is used in general is for measurement, for example, of the level of comprehensiveness of textbooks. So from K to 12 textbooks, they use it and apply it to gauge whether certain, and what is the level of comprehensiveness of particular textbooks. And then in particular case, then of those textbooks, then they would be gauging how difficult would it be for students to engage with that particular material or not. So they are basically measuring the level of concreteness of words, the level of Cohesiveness, I already mentioned, but that cohesiveness could be, for example, how many new information they are providing in a particular text or not, or what is the level of narrativity of a particular text, and several